Hi, and welcome to chapter 2, which is gonna be about hanging pawns. Hanging pawns is an interesting concept. You see them here in the diagram. I mean, the hanging pawns are these two pawns that are sort of they are joined together, but they are also lonely in the terms of the sort of files next to them are gonna be empty. So it's not like an isolated pawn which is just on its own. Hanging pawns are two pawns together who are sort of isolated together in a way. It sounds a little bit weird, but that's kind of how it is. And well, they have good sides and bad sides, but maybe let's try and start it off with a joke. The famous Swedish sort of world elite player Ulf Andersson, very strong grandmaster, known for his subtle positional style, said that the good thing about having an isolated pawn is that if you blunder an isolated pawn, you have no more weaknesses. But if you blunder a hanging pawn, you're really in trouble. And that is a very good point, because they really work together as a team. I mean, if we look at these pawns, you can see that this pawn covers this squares and this one covers these squares. So together, when they stand side by side, they sort of exercise tremendous control. But should one of them disappear, I mean, let's say the d4 pawn is removed, then the square on c5, especially for a knight or a bishop, becomes excellent in terms of blocking. So they really go well together, and they ideally would like to stand side by side. And it's easy to describe a lot of positives, right? Well, we mentioned already the open files that comes with it, which are quite suitable for rooks, I would say. But for the rest of the pieces, of course, it's actually more complicated. I mean, with the Isolani we have a very clear idea of where the pieces go. Here, it's a little bit more difficult. A white squared bishop, sure, on d3, but it could also be on g2, right? The same, would I have my bishop on b2? Yeah, quite likely, and it would be nice on b2, as we would see. But it could also go to g5 quite often in a way. Knight, I assume f3, but do we want it on c3 or do we want it on d2, where it sort of protects this pawn? I cannot fully say that. So it is in many ways a more, I would say, complicated structure than the Isolani. I guess we also see it somewhat less both on amateur level or on elite level. Maybe it sort of occurs slightly less naturally, but I think also due to its complexity. Quite some players try to avoid it. Myself, for instance, I had quite some Isolani positions. Hanging pawns, now they feel a little bit uncomfortable in some kind of way, because it's not that easy where the pieces are going. It's less systematic in a way than I would say the Isolani positions, but that also makes it very interesting. Let's flip the board and talk a little bit from Black's perspective. Is it simple for Black here, where the pieces goes, how we're going to do? Well, I think, like with the Isolani, of course, we really want to have control of this square. We don't want to allow them to play d5 and start really, I mean, especially with the bishop on b2, exercising a lot of activity. But apart from that, very likely gonna castle short, but my bishop could be on g7, or it could be on e7 for sure. Well, knight on f6, but again, knight to c6, or does it go to d7? I cannot surely tell. Often a bishop would go to b6, but not necessarily. And where do I put the rooks? Well, it would be very logical to have a rook on d8 and a rook on c8 to put pressure like this, but actually, quite sometimes we would put the rook where, I mean, the king is placed now, but of course it's going to castle. If you have a rook on e8, it means that should they play d5, you can take back and exploit the open file. And hanging pawns are, I think, just a more complex structure. And, well, maybe it's just numerically, right? There is two pawns that are defining, and they make it more complex than just having one, because there is more mathematical possibilities like that. But generally, well, we want to turn them into weaknesses. We really want to try and hem them, make sure that white cannot use them in in aggressive manner. And when we have well done that, they will eventually turn into weaknesses. So I think well, hanging pawns are very fascinating to talk about, and I think also I hope that you will get the courage to play the hanging pawns positions, because I felt I missed out a little bit of my career not having to try that often. So hang on in this chapter, and we're gonna do our best to explain you the fascination of the hanging pawns. It feels maybe almost ironic, right? Now we have changed the chapter to hanging pawns, and I start you off with a position where there is no hanging pawns but isolated pawns. But it is to show sort of the connectivity of these two structures, how one often leads to the other. This game is meching against Mareko. But, well, partly I also started early here because to talk a little bit about chess theory. This position is called the Karpov variation, which is arises mainly via the Nimzo Indian. And it's considered a very, very strong defense against 4e3 Nimzo Indian, basically to the extent that everybody has just no clue how to deal with it from the white pieces because it's so solid and so good for black. In the 2010 World Championship match between Anand and Topalov, we really wanted to try this e3 system against the Nimzo, but we had no idea how to deal with it from white's perspective. I think that it was sort of became known after the match that while we had our usual team of seconds, we also started to get freelance helps in turn of somebody would call Kasparov, another one would call Kramnik, and we tried to get as much help as we could. This is quite typical during World Championship matches. People tend to be desperate and they try to cash in as many personal favors and they can try and do. But I think it was before probably game 9 that we thought, well, we should play this Nimzo Indian. We're running out of ideas in the Catalan. And we told Kramnik we would like to play the Nimzo Indian. We have no clue what to do against this Karpov system. And Kramnik sort of quite confidently said, yeah, let me have a look at it. I'll find some kind of idea. And he found an idea, but typical for modern chess, it was only an idea that matters as a surprise weapon, and it worked quite well, although that the game ended in a draw. But this is sort of the Tapia of the 4e3 Nimzo, and no one really has a clue. Now and then, beautiful model games like this will appear, and Mekin wins a beautiful game with white, and that typically means that guys like me, who cares a lot about opening theory and work for some top professionals, we start analyzing, okay, did he have a good idea? Did he just play a good game? And, well, let's talk a little bit about that thing in the end. But from our main perspective for understanding hanging pawns, this is just a model game by Meking. Meking was, I think, 59 years old at the time. He was playing candidates in his youth, but then he sort of skipped chess for some time and was very involved in sort of a very religious person and sort of lowered his chess ambitions, but came back at some point and still is a very, very strong player, but of course, considerably older than the present generation at the top, right? Anyway, Meking played the move queen to b3 here, which is sort of, well, it's as atypical. The normal move would be bishop to g5 or even the queen to e2. So after queen b3, black takes on c3 and white takes back with the pawn. And now, well, we have our structure, right? We have this hanging pawns. And the question is, are they going to be good or are they going to be bad? And that's very, very much what the struggle is about. Mareko plays the move bishop to b7. It's extremely logical, but actually it is somewhat the cause of his problems that he doesn't adjust to the circumstances immediately. A better move would probably be to play the move knight to c6, because it kind of disrupts white's setup. I mean, there is a immediate threat of knight a5, sort of forking these queen and bishop, not necessarily winning material, but creating discomfort. And if something like bishop e2, maybe we go bishop b7 first, but there's also going to be ideas like, let's say bishop b7, and we'll try to do knight a5 and rook c8 and put immediate pressure on this structure. I think for theoretical purposes, the move knight c6 would be the correct way to do it. And that basically means that this queen b3 idea of meching, it's not like it's rewriting the evaluation that the Karpov system is great. But luckily for us, it turns out to be a very good illustrative game. So let's focus on that part. Bishop to b7, meching goes bishop a3. Just trying to win a bit of time attacking the rook right here. Rook e8 is forced, and now the move bishop to b5. Again, Mareko probably does it wrong. I think still the correct move would be to play knight to c6 and then to try to jump to a5 later at some point. He plays the move bishop to c6 instead. And I would argue that first it looks very logical because should these pieces be exchanged, that would actually be very favorable for black, because then, I mean, well, let's say just to try and do it as friendly as possible, like this knight a5 comes next, and suddenly the c4 square are going to become a major weakness. Actually, this kind of weakness of the c4 square is part of reason it's called the Karpov system. There is a very famous game where Karpov beats Taimanov with black. He sacrifices a pawn, but somehow gets a knight to c4 and wins beautifully. But of course, meching, I mean, he is more sort of tricky than that. So he plays the move bishop to e2. And basically the idea of, going to b5 and then back to e2 was to lure the bishop to c6. This bishop would much rather be on b7 now, because then you could play the move knight to c6, right? With the bishop on c6, it's somewhat stuck, and it means that black gets somehow nudged into a wrong structure. The game continues knight to d7, white goes c4, queen c7, rook f to e1. And now white starts getting a kind of, I would say, good hanging pawns structure. In this kind of, well, for a start, the bishop is somewhat misplaced here. It would rather be on b7, but of course that can be repaired. But also, I think, as we will see, after, let's say, rook d8, bishop to b2, actually having the bishop on b2 is very, very good. Normally, this bishop would be floating around on g5 or h4, but that's typically because it goes there already in the early phase, and actually it's not necessarily ideally placed there. Well, he will try to end up on g3, but let's say after bishop h4, quite often there would be a move like knight h5, and then somehow black is able to thwart that. On b2, however, it's just beautifully placed. Mainly, it keeps the e5 square under control, so black cannot really play the move e5 and start undermining this pawn. So basically, I would argue that, well, these two pawns backed up by this bishop is pretty ideal in this structure. And, well, basically, Mecking has managed to have his opponent play kind of a standard setup, while Mecking, on the contrary, have managed to get an improved setup. And this position is, I would argue, quite grim for black. Now, in the game, he drifts into passivity. A very typical move in this position would be to play something like this. It's a very typical move in the Karpov line. Well, the threat is to play bishop takes f3, and then something is going to hang on h2. A typical way to sort of deal with it is just to semi-ignore it, to play h3, and then after bishop takes f3, to take back, and we get a very strange position like this. Here, it seems like it's not too bad for black, actually. Somehow, this queen on h2, it can be seen as out of play, but it's also, it's a nuisance for white. It's hard to, I mean, it's always going to be somewhat uncomfortable. It's not like queen h1 is a threat, because then you can go back up to e2. But even, I mean, on h2, it somehow even has ideas to play like that. So probably, it's not like white is worse, but it's somewhat uncomfortable. Actually, after knight g4, the move I like best is the move g3. Generally, I guess it seems a little bit scary in terms of, well, it's weakening this diagonal. And you could argue, sorry, not f2, but g2. That could be some kind of, attack happening there. But in reality, it's not really a problem. I mean, sometimes you just have to live with these kind of things. And I think computer suggests something like knight f6. And then we can play, for instance, a nice move bishop to f1. And we would regroup it here. And still, white's position is somewhat pleasant. Why is white slightly better? I would guess that the pair of bishops is a major factor here. Also, I guess we will start to play a4, and maybe we will start pushing the pawn even further to a5 and annoy the structure a little bit. Of course, a lot of the potential hangs around. At some point, d5 could be a good move. But generally, despite having this sort of broken pawn structure with hanging pawns, when you have a pair of bishops as compensation, when there is no obvious counterplay with e5, it can be very, very pleasant. And basically, that's what kind of happens in the game. After bishop b2 here, Mareko stays passive, knight to f8, the knight jumps to e5, bishop to a8, bishop f1, knight g6. And now I think also a pretty nice move. The first time I sort of saw this kind of move was in a game by Aronian. And first I thought f3, doesn't it look just ugly? Why would you have a structure like this? But I think when I sort of became a better player, I realized that, well, it does block this piece quite a lot. And, well, yeah, of course it weakens my king a little bit. But it doesn't really matter. My king is safe. I have more space. And, well, right now, there's nothing coming and attacking me in this diagonal, right? So sometimes you also have to be able to have the confidence that you're going to weaken yourself to a certain extent if it means that you get considerable gains. And blocking this bishop makes a lot of sense. Another, well, it's not like you have to play f3 immediately. Another very, very decent move would be to play a4, just trying to, swap off your somewhat isolated pawn and then perhaps trying to create some kind of weakness on the black camp. Also, it puts black in a dilemma. Should black allow you to play a5, or alternatively, should you play a5 yourself, but that creates a weakness there. So white has pleasant options here. Making chooses the move f3. And now I think the opponent played knight h4. I think a more logical move would be to swap on e5, but after takes here, h6, a4, white is just pleasantly better. Pair of bishops, and, well, the pawn is going to come to a5, as we described before. It's not like black should necessarily lose, but there's going to be a long, very unpleasant sort of defensive task ahead of you. It's I think we are at the stage where white is maybe not clearly better, but still considerably better, and no one sort of on top level would, take such a position by black sort of on purpose. It's going to be, I mean, unpleasant, and there's absolutely no way to try and relieve pressure because the only sort of reasonable break is e5, and that is very well controlled by white now. Anyway, the game continued, knight to h4. Now bishop d3 happened. I think the author argues that, just something like rook ad1 was even more logical and better. But it's only because of in this position after bishop d3, it turns out that, well, knight h5 to f4 is sort of a random tactic that works. But I think for our purposes, let's just ignore that. The game was knight to d7. There was an exchange, rook takes, and, well, just queens to c2. He's going to put it here. I think we could generally stop around here. It's a very pleasant position for white, but no, I think let's stop it here. It's just the queen goes to f2, I think later to g3, and well, the pawn will come to a4 under normal circumstances, making wins it by having a nice attack. Well, you can see the sort of the game, the full game in the course if you want. But from our perspectives, I thought it was a very nice game where you see that we start up by having, well, first an isolated pawn. It changes the structure to the hanging pawns, and then we see a regrouping phase where, I mean, well, it's very typical for sort of for the hanging pawns that it looks uncomfortable for a while, but the potential is very much there. I mean, this position It doesn't look particularly nice for me. But if you sort of are capable of seeing the potential that arises like this, then suddenly it's perfect harmony. And this is kind of the interesting thing with hanging pawns, that you have to be able to see what can happen sort of behind them, how you will, well, you move the pawn from c3 to c4 and suddenly things starts to happen. And well, you saw with Mecking how he managed to do this very beautifully in the game. We're going to see a very beautiful conceptual game here. It's Aronian against Stevic. This is from 2011, so I would say sort of we are seeing kind of peak Aronian here. And we get to see why these years was peak Aronian, because he plays very, very beautifully here. If you look at this position, I mean, I remember at the time that I was thinking, black has to be fine here. Actually, this at some point this was a very important theoretical position in the symmetrical English. But due to this game and others, basically it started that black had to start to look elsewhere. At first sight, my general impression is black must be doing quite fine, right? Material is a little bit reduced, which kind of helps the defender. The king looks pretty safe here on g7. We have a very easy development with, let's say, knight a5, b6, bishop goes to b7. And we can put, well, let's say, rooks on c8 and d8, the queen on f6. It looks perfectly solid and everything is all right. But that is kind of a too static understanding of the position. I'm somewhat seeing only the options for black. What is lacking is the understanding of the potential of the hanging pawns, how they are capable of moving forward. And Aronian does it very well. But also, it's a position that is somewhat hanging in the balance. And a huge part of why white is better here is the next move, which is impossible to guess if you don't know it. Aronian starts by the move queen to b5. I mean, for me, it's an amazing move, and it was, I have to admit, very, very hard to understand. Part of it is that it's really annoying, the black position, right? What black would like to do is to play b6 and bishop b7, but that you can't do because the knight is hanging on c6. I mean, moves like, let's say, queen b6, but I guess taking it leads to a pleasant ending for white, or there could also moves like queen to g5, I would guess. So, in the game, black plays queen to c7. But I would argue that the critical move is knight to a5. Then, again, by normal means, the game would continue something like, let's say, bishop to d3, black develops with b6, and now it's just going to be bishop to b7 next, and it's not so easy to do something about it. But after knight a5, the correct move is actually bishop to b3. Again, I don't know what to say. It goes against most principles, right? I mean, why would we allow them to take voluntarily on b3? Well, reality is that they're not really going to take there, because we're going to take back, and that's going to massively improve our pawn structure. But what's the idea of having it here in this diagonal? Well, a huge part of the attraction is that after b6, we're going to give a check. Queen has to sort of interpolate an f6, and then we're going to go queen g3, bishop b7, and now the nice move knight to e5. And this starts becoming somewhat annoying. And, well, what is the big difference? Well, if we look at after knight a5, bishop d3, and we try to do the same, then in this scenario, rook c8 actually is very annoying, because then our pawn is, on c3 is not protected. And somehow black becomes in time for the defense. If we switch back to the bishop on b3, we see in let's say, this position, well, you can play rook c8, but I'm going to go rook fe1, and now suddenly there is threats to take on f7 maybe, or I mean after rook d8 probably knight f7 could be winning, but even a move like rook e3 is actually very nice, because we're gonna double in the e file, and this pawn is not really weak, and maybe we can start pushing moves like h4 and start attacking, or some points a move like knight g4 could be very strong. So it's kind of weird that we keep this bishop on a odd square on b3, but in this exact position after knight a5, bishop b3 is very surprisingly strong. it's still like when I when I tell it to you. I mean, if I didn't have the computer telling me that, well, this is the way to do it, I would not be able to, because it feels so counterintuitive. But it works out in this specific position. And because it works out in these specific positions, after queen b5, black has to take some kind of different measures, which means white actually gonna get what he wants. So the game goes queen to c7. Bishop drops back to e2 now, rook d8, rook f d1, b6. But we can see that black somehow has slowed a little bit down, right? So after c4, knight e7, queen b2, things are actually quite pleasant for white. I mean, like we saw in the previous example, these kind of weak hanging pawns has become quite active here. And well, when I was talking about the king being safe on g7, I kind of meant that there would be a queen on f6 to protect it. Now, d5 check is actually a threat. So Stiewitz quite logically backs down. Probably was better to play f6, but I mean, if you play f6, of course, you will have a permanent weakness on e6, and it's unpleasant to do like that. White is better. But king g8 happens, and now this very nice move, knight to e5. And kind of the problem is now that, well, if you develop normally with bishop to b7, then you're going to be hit by d5, and you can't really take it because something like knight g4 is going to basically create a disaster on the weaknesses around the black king. So after knight e5, it's a very unpleasant position. Part of it is, well, this king was not as weak, as safe as I tried to promise. Also, I mean, well, these weaknesses here. And somehow white managed to do this queen b5 and speed things up. And this has ended pretty sadly. In the game, Stiewitz tries to move h5. Very logical, right? Covers the g4 square. But Aronian then switches to a different scenario. He plays the move d5 and tries to break through in the center. Maybe now, I mean, you could try and hang in and play a move like rook d6. It's not going to be pretty, but somehow it's not losing immediately. I think bishop f3 is the correct move, and then we're going to switch the rook to e1 here. But luckily for us, after d5, Stiewitz sort of obliged. He takes on d5, and white is going to take back, and well, we see the rook's activity here. Queen d6 happens, and now, of course, should black get sufficient time to sort of stabilize his position? I mean, even could he get to play queen f6 next and sort of pinning the knight? Things would be great, but it's white to move, and, well, knight c4 happens, and now the d pawn is just going to roll forward. So the game was something like queen f4, d6, knight f5, d7, and I think the author ends the game after queen g5, g3, and says basically this pawn is just way too dominant, and white is completely winning, which the computer also says. I would guess that there is many ways. Maybe the knight is going to go back to e5 and we're going to attack the f7 square, but that somehow is not too relevant. White is strategically winning at this point. I think, and for me, it was something that really changed my understanding of hanging pawns here. That, I mean, my intuition still tells me here that these pawns, they are weak. And again, when I see this position, I have to switch on the computer to actually convince myself, no, white is still better. I still somehow hope that maybe there's a newer engine has come out which will change the evaluation, so my intuition is right. But my intuition is just wrong. White is better here, and it's a lot has to do with this brilliant move, queen b5. I mean, discoveries like this, I mean, one really has to be impressive with. I mean, it's not like I haven't found quite some openings, my ideas myself. I'm a professional working for world champions. Of course, this will happen. But this kind of deep conceptual ideas, you will sometimes see like happen for someone like Aronian. Aronian is really, I would say, a thinker. He likes to think in deep concepts. And, well, chess is not always like that, but when it is like that, it becomes very beautiful. And I hope you're as excited about this game as I am. We are continuing our sort of discussion of, well, this is a typical Karpov-Nimzo Indian structure, and it's very defined with the debate about, is this hanging pawns good for white, or are they vulnerable, can be undermined by black? The general consensus is that the Karpov system is a pretty good system for black. But there is one player who always tried to uphold white's chances, and this is a Ukrainian player, Anton Korobov. And this is the game where he has the white pieces against Macheyev from 2010. 2010 is quite early for Korobov. A few years later, he's going to have his breakthrough in the World Cup in Tromsø in Norway. I think in Tromsø in Norway, he made a huge impression on a lot of people, both on and off the board. I mean, he was playing brilliant chess on the board, but also off the board. He was giving some very, funny or peculiar interviews where somehow people would think, okay, is he joking? Is he sarcastic? Or does he say what he means? They were very interesting. So I'll always suggest Googling them and have a look. But also as a player, he's quite interesting because, like his interviews, they're quite deep and it's not like you will grasp everything at first sight. And this is a little bit the same here. He's taking the white pieces in this hanging pawns structure, trying to show that there is actually considerable attacking chances below the surface. We're going to start it from here in what I would say is, it looks like a very, very standard position. Both players have their pieces in basically somewhat optimal or at least typical squares, right? The white bishops are nice places. The knight is on f3, the rook is on e1 and an open file. From black's perspective, kind of the same. The bishop in the long diagonal, knights in typical squares, the rooks where they're supposed to be, and so is the queen. So basically, this position can be described as typical as it gets. But actually, it's a slightly favorable version for white. And I think after the game, we will backpedal a bit and try to see how black could have done it better. But first, let's try and understand this position. The game continues knight to e5, and it's quite praised by the author, but actually the computer makes a relevant point, so it's not really the best move. What the computer wants to do is to play the move a4. Well, it also says that you could consider backing here with the bishop, but a4 is always quite a nice move if you have the time to do it. Generally, it tries assaulting the black pawn structure. Well, this is an isolated pawn, right? But if we can manage to change our isolated pawns from one of the black, in principle, nice connected pawns, then we are removing one of our weaknesses and giving black a weakness in exchange. And there's not that much black can do about it because, well, one thing is allowing a5, another thing is to block it, but then this pawn on b6 become backwards. So after a4, black somehow has to try and react. A typical way of doing that would be the move e5. E5 sort of challenges these pawns, and should you choose to play d5, then suddenly weak square starts to appear on c5, even on d6 if you could manage to transfer the knight there. So after e5, white has to react somewhat actively. And the typical move here is bishop to f5. And this exactly targets the rook on c8. And that's what I meant before with black's position, perhaps looking optimal, but not being it exactly, is that there is this tactic with bishop f5. Should you play the logical move taking on d4, then white can swap on f6. You cannot really take back with the knight because c8 is hanging. And after g takes f6, well, you have seriously weakened your king side. So after the move bishop f5, the computer plays rook b8, sort of getting the rook out of harm's way. But then white can play the move d5. And I think this is a situation where it's more important to have this pawn structure than the downside of weakening these squares, because well, there's a considerable mobility in the d pawn. The computer gives a considerable edge here. Should you play queen takes c4, white is going to play d6, and there is massive compensation for the sacrificed pawn. So this is quite interesting to play a4 under these circumstances. But our game continues knight to e5. Maciej takes it, which is very logical. I mean, you can play a move like h6, but I think the author just points out that, well, knight takes d7, something like this is pleasant for white. Or after h6, you could even choose to go to f4 with the bishop, also having a very nice position, taking back on e5 with the bishop. So the game continues, knight takes e5. Now Korobov takes with the pawn and is extremely successful with that, but only because of Maciej's response. The book suggests taking with the rook, and this generally also easily could lead to a structural edge for white. I mean, after a typical move like knight d7, the book goes rook e3 and says that the rook is actually quite nicely placed here. It will find, some kind of attacking chances on the king side. I don't know if bishop takes h7 is immediate threat, but we are in that kind of region. Also, well, this bishop managed to lure the knight to here, so somehow the king side is somewhat bare, right? I mean, this is an interesting position, but quite promising for white. But after rook takes e5, details really matters. And black should play the move queen to c6. And this creates kind of annoying counterplay. There is a threat of mate on g2, obviously. This, well, you can defend quite easily. But if you play a move like f3, then kind of the rook cannot go in this direction anymore, right? So maybe bishop f1 would be the logical move, and if we start retreating with the knight, white is still positionally better. But knight e4 is a nice, annoying move. It attacks the bishop like this, and after bishop e3, we can jump to d6, and suddenly we start, attacking the pawn here, but also putting the knight on the nice square f5, where it will start attacking structure like that. It's not like black is better already at all, but black has a quite reasonable position. So I think, the author says rook takes e5 is a better move, and that could be. But the evaluation is a little bit wrong, but only because of this very strong move, queen to c6. And if the bishop goes back, we're going to jump to e4. So I think queen c6 is an important theme to remember. But, you will see a much stronger instance of that in just a second. Because in this position, Korobov took back with the pawn. And now Maciej simply blunders. He plays the move knight to d7. And I think his idea is, well, let's, attack this weak pawn immediately. My knight is going to jump to this square. And I will just repel the white attack, and he will be forced sort of to defend his weaknesses long term. Unfortunately, for black's perspective, that does not reflect reality at all. The right move here is to play queen c6 again. And, it's an extremely typical theme. We already saw it once here in the Karpov system, that you have to annoy white immediately before his initiative grows. If you go f3 here, there's even a nice trick knight to g4, and suddenly, a check here is going to be very inconvenient for the king. Well, you can't take back, of course, on g4 because there's mate on g2. So again, bishop f1 would be a reasonable move, but the same thing here. We can jump to e4 with a knight, and suddenly, we have managed to force his bishop back to f1, so he's not attacking the king side anymore, right? And we have gotten a nice square on e4 where we attack the bishop backwards, so on and so forth. It's obviously a so much better version of what appears in the game. But for illustrative purposes, it's nice that Maciej plays the move knight to d7, and then comes a very, very strong move, queen to h5. Simply, white doesn't waste time, defending this pawn, or doesn't care about this square. He focuses all the energy on attacking the black king side, and the black king side is very vulnerable. So the weaknesses that matters is the kind of lonely king side like this. Maciej now goes knight to f8. You could also go g6, but after queen h6, there is this immediate threat of bishop f6 basically mating. Black can hang on with queen c5. Rook comes to e3, threatening to go here with this destruction. black has the nice defensive move queen f8, but the queen goes back like this, and next we're gonna play rook h3, and it's a very dangerous position. The computer says that white is borderlining winning already, so it's a very tough situation. But well, what Maciej plays is also not that great. So knight to f8, and now the move rook to e3. I remember in sort of my youth, when I was starting out in the Karpov variation from black's perspective, it was difficult for me to sort of really feel that such positions are incredibly dangerous for black. Basically, I mean, you know, it looks like, well, I have a strong defensive knight, right? It defends my only weakness here, and all my pieces are in nice situations. What can go wrong? But being more mature, I think it's pretty easy to see that, well, white has a considerable amount of firepower attacking my king, and I'm expecting only to defend it with one knight, right? This is, it is kind of numerically naive, and I guess what sort of deceives me is that, well, I'm a positional player, so I start looking at weaknesses like this, and sure, they are weaknesses, but, well, if you give mate, it doesn't really matter, right? There's not going to be any kind of ending where this matters. And this position is generally just horrible. I think, well, something like knight g6, you just got to bring the last piece into sort of defending the pawn, and we're going to put a rook somewhere, maybe on h3 next, and we're going to smash through. It's just pretty hopeless. Maciej tried the move queen to c6, but rook g3 is very useful in terms of attacking the opponent king, but also defending our only weak pawn sort of backwards. So it basically combines the pleasant positive with the necessary defensive. Game goes rook to c1, and now bishop takes h7 is a beautiful way to finish off the game. Bishop f6, should you choose the logical move g6, then there is this very petite combination. You sacrifice the queen, and it's going to be mate on h8. Well, we can show it like this. The game was queen takes c4, which at least is a humorous way to give white the chance to blunder, because rook takes g7, king f8. Now, should you play the move queen takes h7? Well, it looks like mate and next move, and it is kind of mate and next move, but the joke is on you, because there is back rank mate like this, right? But well, of course, Korobov doesn't fall for that. He's played a nice move, queen takes h6, which again positively targets your opponent's kings, but also defends the c1 square. And after rook ec8, rook g8 check. Maciej resigned because takes is checkmate here. Anyway, this paints this brilliant sort of picture for white, but as I sort of generally vouched for this being a pretty good system for black, let me sort of zoom back to that and try to explain what sort of goes wrong. So this is kind of the normal Nimzo. Now Karpov system is b6, but move orders can be a little bit sort of reversed at times. So Maciej goes knight d7, bishop d3, b6, a3, takes. And now I guess one could already start considering playing the move queen to c7, because it does sort of ask the questions what to do with this weakness. And should white play the move c4, then already black could put his bishop on a6 and start attacking it immediately. But after queen c7, white could still consider playing the move bishop to b2. I think I explained at some point in the first game that actually b2 sometimes is a pretty ideal square, while normally the bishop would end up on g5. And as we saw in the game, it can be very efficient there. But it's not necessarily where you want it. It's just where it end up sort of by circumstances, because quite often, well, what black would not take on c3 immediately. Well, here it's forced by a3. And because of that, you could consider playing bishop to b2. A typical way to counter that would be something like queen f4 and attacking on f3. But it is quite relevant and interesting to understand that bishop takes f3, you could consider it an interesting possibility, but it's not necessarily a threat. For instance, a4, bishop takes f3, queen takes. an ending like this is kind of weirdish, right? I mean, sure, we have some very ugly pawns. We have hanging pawns, which also could be considered a weakness. Of course, this pawn is weak as well. But we have a pair of bishops, and well, we are planning to play a5 next. The computer evaluates this as slightly better for white, and I think that's quite a reasonable evaluation. But it's a double-edged sort of situation. There is a famous game, actually, Loche against Magnus Carlsen here, where in a World Cup, Magnus managed to win. I mean, but he got one knight to f4 and the other one to maybe g6 or maybe h7, g5, and won a complicated position. But mainly because Magnus was the better player. And it's a very interesting structure. So I'm just trying to basically educate you in the way that this is not necessarily a lethal weakness, more like a complex feature. Anyway, after bc3, the game was bishop to b7, rook e1, rook e8. And now Korobov plays the move bishop g5. And the computer sort of stands by what I was trying to explain a couple of times, that that's not necessarily the right square for the bishop. The computer wants to go c4 immediately. And after queen c7, then we can start making the move knight to e5. And somehow the bishop keeps its options open. And here it seems to think that the white position is actually quite pleasant in a way. So I think, well, bishop g5, it's incredibly logical, but also sometimes a little bit superfluous. Maciej goes queen c7, and after the move c4, rook a to c8, we get to our starting position. But as I kind of showed, that this rook on c8 was a little bit vulnerable to this tactic, right? So in this position, actually the right move is probably the move the move h6. Well, of course, you could start reshuffling your bishop to b2, but probably then black can play something like e5. So bishop to h4 is the logical move. If the bishop could get to the g3 square, it will start attacking the queen. So black basically has to react. As we spoke about, something like bishop f4 exists, but I guess we would just play bishop g3, and after a move like bishop takes f3, it's both possible to take back here and have an interesting ending, but even this move has been seen where, again, we play with this kind of pawns, but white has attacking chances down the g-file, but also just in general, a pair of bishops and an interesting position. I mean, I don't know how to evaluate this, but to just say it's bad for white would definitely be superfluous. So after the move, bishop to h4, probably the strongest move is knight h5, which is very typical here. I mean, it somehow hems this bishop a little bit, and it can't really go to g3 properly. Maybe we could go with our queen to f4 next, and then we are capable of taking the bishop on g3, or at some points we might jump with the knight to f4. It basically becomes a very complex struggle, but this is, well, I was trying to explain some of the nuances that I know from black's perspective in the Karpov system, so that you don't only end up thinking that the Karpov system is just so great for white, because it's basically considered a good opening for black. But I hope you got a good grasp of some of the pros of con of the Karpov system, and also enjoyed Korobov's amazing attacking play. Here, I think an important example of how weak hanging pawns actually can be. It's sort of, well, as we have seen by now, hanging pawns can be very defining and very interesting. But I think part of why they have a somewhat bad reputation is that when they are bad, they can be really bad. And I think it's important to show some example of that. And the author has chosen a game here between Mareko and Tov from 2012. And it's also quite nice because Mareko we saw on the losing side against the Mekin, but here he gets really to shine. He has the white pieces here, and I mean, at first sight, how would we evaluate these hanging pawns. They could look quite decent, right? They cover a lot of squares, and being backed up properly, maybe, they would actually be fine. If black was to move here, things perhaps would not be too bad, actually. But it's white to move, and well, the next move is just so typical of how to attack hanging pawns. White plays the move knight to b3, and that immediately exposes the huge flaw in black's setup, because, well, this knight is attacking this weak pawn, and this bishop attacks that weak pawn. So basically, there's no way to, defend them both in any kind of reasonable way. That just, no good way exists. Well, you can't call it a fork, but it's basically a discovered double attack. That means black has no reasonable way to do. What black has to do, not to lose material immediately, is to play the move c4. But then, after knight d4, white's advances is just obvious, right? Well, this is just two weak pawns, and this is a beautiful square on d4, and white is being just considerably better in this situation. So I think, well, we will see the end of the game, because it's short and quite beautiful. But I just want to return to knight b3, and says this is an incredibly important theme. But actually, because this move is so quite good, maybe the author misses us that there maybe even is a better move, or maybe it's just a more modern computer. And even that is quite a typical move as well. It's an interesting move, knight to b1. And, well, this renews the threat on the pawn on d5. And actually, there's no reasonable way to defend it, right? If you move the knight somewhere, then, let's say knight f6, well, then this pawn is just going to drop. So basically, I think computer says the only reasonable way to defend it is something like queen g5, trying to defend centrally like this. But then after knight c3, the position becomes very, very bad for black. But, well, this is just, I would say, an additional extra that white can play like this. But, knight b3 is a theme you really have to know fighting against hanging pawns, or also just having hanging pawn yourselves, because you cannot allow like this, because this is basically immediate positional capitulation. But I thought knight b1 is a nice sort of additional thing to know, because it also happens in quite some structures that the knight from d2 jumps back to b1 and then continues putting tremendous pressure on these pawns. Anyway, knight b3 happens, c4, knight d4. Of course, it becomes a debate on how disastrous is the position, and it is kind of defendable, perhaps. I think computers suggest something like knight to e5, and after b3, queen d7, the best move is knight f3 takes, and after, let's say, takes here, takes back. White's advantage is undisputed and considerable, but of course, even should white win a pawn, there is quite some drawing chances. It's mainly that the black position obviously is very, very sad and unpleasant. So no one would go here voluntarily, but I would not be extremely surprised that by perfect computer play, black can actually quite often make a draw. But that goes for a lot of things. There's just absolutely no reason to play like that with black, unless you are basically a masochist. Todt tried the move queen to a5, and instead of starting to immediately defend the weak pawn on a2, Mareko does it very nicely. He plays the move b3, and well, you could of course make the argument that why is he trying to exchange off a weak pawn? But I guess if you want to get to attack the pawn on d5, it's kind of helpful to do it like this. I guess if you do like this, we're going to take back immediately, and there's going to be some trouble down the b file. Maybe you can play rook b8 in this position, actually. But white is, well, is kind of isolating the weakness, while the pawn on c4 has some kind of defensive measure there. I think also the author mentions that, well, if you take the pawn on a2, you're gonna go rook a1 first, attacking the queen, and then when it goes to b2, you will take on c4. And now, apart from threatening to take on d5, there's the added threat of rook b1 winning the bishop on b7, and basically black's position becomes undefendable. So after b3, Todt does this quite logical move, rook to b8, partly defending his bishop on b7, which means that, well, if you take on c4 now, we can actually sort of take back with counterplay because our bishop is defended. But knight f5, as played in the game, is a nice way of sort of starting to go after the d5 pawn like this, and also it opens the queen for a further attack of that. Knight f6 happens, and now white slows down a little bit, but in a very nice way. The rook to c2. It basically, of course, immediately defends the pawn like this. But in terms of attacking the pawn on d5, actually this idea of putting the rook on d2 and the knight on e3 is a quite typical theme. Maybe we should try and put it on the board just by making some moves like this. It basically combines massively taking control of the d4 square and blocking it, but at the same time also, being able to attack the pawn on d5. I think it was Nimzowitsch who argued that the passed pawn should be blocked, and I think Larsen sort of says, well, the passed pawn shouldn't only be blocked; it should be taken. And someone was asking Larsen, "Is it well? Are you contradicting Nimzowitsch?" He said, "No, it's more like an evolutionary comment that." Some stage is that you block it, but also the idea of blocking it is actually to win it. And I think, well, as I mentioned, I think Karpov have been doing this kind of setup, and it's, it makes a lot of sense, right? Rook on d4, knight on e3, the pawn is blocked, and at some point we can maybe even bring another rook, and basically there will not be enough black defenders to defend the pawn. Anyway, after rook c2, he went to rook fd8, and now a nice move, queen c1. For a start, we stopped having kind of paranoid thoughts of having the queen in the same diagonal. We start insinuating that we would like to just take the pawn on c4, but also, especially, we create the immediate threat of queen d5 playing for mate like this. Todt plays the move h6, which is a logical move, right, controlling the g5 square. But as we will see, it also comes with considerable downside. Queen f4 happens here. Now there is a threat of taking on h6 when we can take on f6 afterwards. So cb3 takes, queen b6, and rook f to c1. I will say it has developed quite naturally here. But it's probably important to stress that this position is extremely favorable for white. I don't think one should fall for the mistake of thinking maybe white is only slightly better because of the isolated pawn. No, white is slightly better due to the isolated pawn, but he has so many pluses. I mean, he has full control of the c-file, he has a very strong knight on f5 and a queen on f4. Basically, the power of the remaining pieces makes this, I would argue, close to winning situation. I think computers suggest that now you should play the move knight e8, and white is much better anyway. I think the book gives the move rook c5 here. It doesn't matter so much. The game goes d4, and bishop takes b7. If queen takes b7, then you can just take an h6, and when you take back, f6 is hanging, right, and h6 is going to drop next. So the game was rook to b7, but now a very nice small combination. Rook to c6, queen takes b3, and after rook f6, gf6, like this, there's no reasonable way, or no way at all actually, to prevent queen g7 mate. So the game finished like that. Of course, a completely overpowering performance for white, but I thought a nice example. But of course, let's just start where we sort of end where we started, in this position that it's important, of course, to see the positive things of our hanging pawns. But we also have to understand that they can be incredibly vulnerable and basically be lost immediately. And not necessarily lost in a physical way of that they are gonna disappear and off the board. But after knight b3, we see that the nice sort of dynamics of these two pawns standing next to each other can be broken. And while these pawns are nice, after c4, knight d4, these pawns are basically horrible. There's no dynamic potential. They don't cover relevant squares in a tandem, and this knight on d4 has just become brilliant. So basically, I would say that, well, the key message is to have a huge warning signal of the pawns like this, because they can be great, but really make sure they can't be attacked, exposed, and you are forced to move one of them with all the holes it creates behind them. A very interesting example chosen here by the author. It's a game from 2009 between Bachmann and Corneo. I mean, I call it interesting for perhaps some strange reasons, but for me it was interesting in the sense that it left me very, very confused. I mean, for a start, I wasn't sure, should I present this from white, should I present this from black side, because it's sort of a double-edged example. Also, trying to get to grasp this position was very, very difficult for me, and I can't say that I grasp it fully now. I mean, it looks like white's pieces are more or less ideally placed, right? We have bishop is in nice diagonals, we have rook in nice files, our queen is well positioned, and the knight, at least the knight on f3 is well placed. The knight on d2, well, maybe we would like it on c3, but that can be difficult for some practical reasons at times. From black's perspective, also quite reasonable, right? I mean, bishops are where they're supposed to be. Knight of f6 is fine. Perhaps the only slight awkwardness could be the knight on c6, but the knight on c6 could also be aggressively placed. On the d7, it will be more solidly placed, for instance, especially covering the pawn on c5. And perhaps the weakness of the pawn on c5 is sort of key in this position. I mean, white is sort of lurking with a lot of b4 pushes. This is basically the theme, which is quite surprising to me. But, well, let's say black plays rook f to e8, which would be my natural move. At first, it's probably important to understand that bishop takes f6, queen takes c5. It's not that big of a deal. Black will play the move bishop to b2 and basically attack like this, and when the queens are exchanged, the bishop will take back on a3, and sure, we have an isolani, but we have a pair of bishops. It's basically equal. So after rook e8, at first I thought, okay, I mean, this must be fine for black, but the book says knight to e1, and it's actually a very strong move. I mean, it's not even like it renews the threat of bishop takes f6 immediately, but the knight starts coming to d3 next, and then this pawn on c5 becomes a serious weakness. The author suggests that maybe knight b8 is the best move, but then after knight d3, knight d7, b4, actually white has a very pleasant version of what's going to happen in the game. So quite surprisingly to me, in this position, rook f8 is kind of a misunderstanding of what's going to happen next. It just looks like, I mean, such a natural move, right? We're going to take the open file, and that's by far what my default move would be. But Corneo actually plays more deep. He plays the move knight to d7. And, well, it reinforces the pawn on c5, right, by protecting it. And also it stops bishop takes f6 possibilities. And, I mean, should you choose to play the move knight e1, well, then you will jump here. And actually this is quite a nice square, right? Because it somehow dominates, or at least restricts the knight on e1, that either if it goes to d3 or to f3, black can just exchange it. I mean, it's a theme I have seen very rarely, if ever, but it's actually quite nice that you try to just occupy this nice central square, but especially you're ready to swap off this knight if should it come to d3, right? So knight e1 is not really the right move here. A move that comes very close to being strong would be knight to b1. We have seen this theme before. Of course, it looks a little bit passive, but the idea is to jump to c3 and then target this pawn, but even some knight a4 tactics as well. But black is okay, but only by a very, very precise play. So knight a5, very logical hitting at this pawn, right? And after the move b4, black should play knight c4. Knight c4 is a very nice move. It's not too greedy, but it sort of instead tries to actually exploit that this great square has become available, and white cannot immediately take on c5 because something would hang on b2. But should white black be lured into taking the pawn, actually quite bad things could happen more or less immediately. I think the author, it's not the author, it's me who has added a line like this. Now you go bishop d4 threatening the queen, and after queen d6, perhaps it looks like things are not really too bad, right? But they kind of are. And knight h4 is a very nice way of exploiting this. I mean, it threatens to jump to f5 immediately, and then g7 would collapse, or actually, rather, bishop takes g7 is a threat now. And when you go g6, bishop a1 is a very nice move. Basically, we're going to put our queen to b2, and we're going to, create considerable trouble for the king here in this diagonal. And it's not like it's losing immediately, but the computer says more than, I think, +1 here. It's a huge attack, which black is not really ready for. So knight b1 is a nice move, but there is actually this clever way of combating it. So in this position, I mean, I was not really able to find anything very convincing. I think the author also discusses e4, but after something like d4, it's not particularly overwhelming. The game goes queen to f5, a very typical move in these kind of structures also, especially now with the pawn on h6. Quite often black would be able to play g6 in such structures, and then white would actually put the queen on h3, which perhaps here is even better because it attacks the weakness here. I mean, I could understand if you would find it weird having moving the queen from a normal square to a weird one like h3, but sometimes it has attacking benefits on the king's side, and it's a maneuver worth knowing at least. But well, g6 is not a great move here. The game goes knight a5, which actually is wrong. Just returning the knight is actually quite reasonable because, well, bishop takes f6 is now less of a threat because we don't have any attack on the c5 pawn, right? So after knight f6, I understand I'm yo-yoing my knight, but also then, if the queen goes to h3, we have bishop c8 at times. It's quite a reasonable move. There's also another reasonable move, which actually would be to play the move a5. As we will see, a lot of things are connected with white pushing b4 and undermining black's structure. So given the chance to play a4 here is actually quite good. And well, the point is that if something like queen takes d4, I guess probably it's knight d4 in this exact situation, right? And should you go queen c4 defending here, I guess bishop a6 is winning the queen or something like that, right? At least it's winning an exchange as a minimum. So a5 would also be strategically interesting. In the game, Corneo plays knight a5, and well, perhaps it looks quite nice. It attacks the weakened pawn, which sort of the queen has abandoned. But white could even play the move b4 now. Actually, I think our author says that b4 in this position would be an even better move. But the game continues: rook to b1. Knight back to f6, queen back to c2. Again, b4 is good, but we will just see b4 in the way it happens. So knight h4. Again, this typical move, it's heading towards the f5 square. And it also exploits that due to this structure, you cannot really play g6 because it would very often allow a sacrifice. So the game goes queen to e6. And then after b4, well, you cannot, of course, not take twice, because if you do like that, then bishop takes f6 is just going to win material because of this threat, right? So basically, white is getting in a sort of a favorable undermining of these pawns. And well, game was knight to b7. White played knight h to f3 and 1, but the author points to that knight b3 would be an even better move, because if you start taking on b4, you play c4, then the knight enters with tempo like this, and white is considerably better. I think I will stop the game here now, but just let's finish off with where we started, right? I mean, this strikes me as a very interesting position to learn something from. And well, I'm starting to realize that at best, this knight is somewhat double-edged placed here, but it looks so nice. But if there's no immediate sort of benefit when we can push d4, which is difficult because there will always be something like knight c4, then it kind of weakens the pawn on c5 with threats like this. But they are not perhaps that immediate and that clear. Perhaps the strongest impression of me was that rook f8 is actually wrong due to knight e1. I mean, understanding a move like knight e1 is still... oh, that is a very impressive move. And it's... isn't it a little bit fascinating that this, at sight, quite passively placed army is actually doing very well in undermining these pawns. So I think this is a beautiful picture to sort of finish off this chapter on. I mean, for me, well, this is really fascinating in chess, that somehow you can undermine things like that. And maybe this is very much into the theme of this hanging pawns, that they can be weak or they can be strong, but if they are, you know, locked, then they can be undermined, even with something like this. Okay. The final game of this chapter is I think, quite an interesting example and a good way to round it off. Well, at first sight, it just looks like a very clean victory by white, and we start off in a position where the author says that it's basically porcelain, that as many as 8 grandmasters have gotten this position with black, because, well, there is just a weak structure like this, and also there is potential weakness of the c5 square. So the conclusion at that time was that white is just much better here. And I mean, the game goes on, let's say, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2. And now we see immediately that, well, white has a numerical advantage on this weak pawn. So the game goes bishop to d7 defending it, and after knight to b3, we already have a knight who's going to jump to this very nice square with a very pleasant advantage for white. We can look at the details. Rook fb8 was played, and after knight c5, the game goes bishop to e8. It's possible to try and bail out with a move like this, but after knight takes d7, you have to take back because, well, you can't take on c2, obviously, because now you lose a piece as it's check. So knight d7, something like this. And, well, this position, in principle, could be interesting to discuss, but it's somewhat out of the scope of this course. But black is a clean pawn down, obviously extremely good winning chances for white, but in a sort of symmetrical way that I would say black has quite decent drawing chances here. I could very much see some elite players, let's say especially Magnus, deciding to, okay, I will go for this and I will try and draw it. But of course, going here on purpose is a quite strange thing. It's black ended up in an accidental position, and maybe this is a better way to try and draw. Anyway, after knight c8, the game was bishop e8. And we see b3. Well, basically, it's just a very good position for white for a number of reasons. I mean, black has 3 pawn islands, right? This knight is extremely strong. It blocks the weak pawns. This bishop on e8 is very passive. You can basically only say negative things about the black position, and all what black is doing is trying to limit the damage and try to hang in there, right? Game goes queen a7, and perhaps we will stop after this interesting move e4. Well, if it was an Isolani position, of course, exchanging off a set of pawns is not the way we would do it. But when we're talking about hanging pawns, there is quite some idea of exchanging a set of pawns, because that will leave the last one very, very weak. And this is quite a typical way of doing it. It's also, I mean, here, well, white has to do something next. Of course, well, you could move your rooks to slightly better positions. There's many ways to make some kind of progress, but e4 is a logical way of trying to do it, but black is still somewhat unbalanced. And Maciej went on to win a nice game. If we go back to our starting position here, I think the author says that, well, you could also go bishop d7 and start the defending like this. Then at least there is still some kind of tension. If you take here, well, we can take back with the pawn perhaps, and at least, pretend to have some kind of counterplay like that. So I think after bishop d7, the computer suggests this like nice little sort of semi-move bishop c3. Maybe it threatens to take on f6, right? And if, let's say, bishop e7, we will go bishop d4, queen to b7, and now the nice move, knight to c3. You can never really, I mean, you can't undermine like this, because we're just gonna win a pawn like that. And, well, rook b8, knight a4. Again, we get beautiful control of this c5 square. We have a knight on a4, which is basically untouchable, and white has a major, major advantage. So going back to this position, we should remember the conclusion from the author, who said that, well, it's surprising that as many as 8 grandmasters has gotten this position. I'm really not trying to make fun of the author, because I would have said exactly the same thing at the exact same time. But modern Indians has a very, very different perspective on it. And right now, we have more than 100 games in this position, and the conclusion is black is doing absolutely fine. So let's flip the board and talk about it from the black side. How can this be a reasonable position for black? Well, these problems are still there. We do have weak pawns, and we have seen by the examples that if we keep defending them passively, things are not going to be that great for us. So we start off with a modern move, rook to b8. We're just creating some kind of counterplay. And, well, should white take here, I guess we can start taking either on b2 immediately or exchange the queens first. And it's going to be very drawish. So white is not going to do that, of course. A logical move would be the move knight to c3, and this is very much what has been played in a bunch of games. But looking at this position from black's side, where do we see some weakness in the white camp? Well, maybe it's easy nowadays, because we have seen so many AlphaZero games. We have Leela Zero, who is basically some kind of clone of AlphaZero to analyze with. So we have changed our perspective of chess, and a big part of it is that, well, we can see this king side is a little bit lonely, which means in this position we can play the move h5, which is extremely strong. The idea is to push h4, and we could even push it all the way to h3, or we could open the g file, depending on circumstances. It's very, very typical modern chess. A huge part of the thing is that there is no knight on f3 preventing the f4 square. So here our argument would be well, this king is somewhat lonely, and white is putting all his attention on the queen side. I mean, let's say knight a4 is a typical move, and we play queen to d8. Because of the tension with these two pieces, there's no way white can just pick up the c6 pawn for free. And we're gonna go h4 next. Our queen on d8 is gonna enter the action somewhere around here. Believe it or not, but this position is just considered completely fine for black. And actually, well, rook b8, even perhaps more instructive, is, let's say, takes. Again, you go b3 to sort of, well, I can't take on b2 and renew the threat. And black is not going to waste time defending it. h5 is an excellent move, and should you play queen takes c6, well, then bishop f5 is great. We're going to go rook c8 next. And the sort of pieces there are actually, pretty entangled, and black is already better. So rook b8 is basically, well, like we did, we turned the board, it turns the tables. Not like black is necessarily better, but black is completely fine. And, well, I would almost say, I hope you're confused, because, well, this is backward hanging pawns. it's supposed to be bad, but somehow they are holding the fort while we are trying to regroup and attack on the king's side. So I thought this is a very cool example to finish off with. We see that hanging pawns, can be dynamic, and also we see that it's a very complicated structure to judge. And well, I would almost hope you're a little bit confused, because I was trying to confuse you more or less on purpose. But the point is that it's a difficult structure, and hopefully, well, we now, after this chapter, know it better, and we're going to have a competitive edge against our opponent, or at least we are confused, but on a higher level.